So today I'm going to be highlighting a project that I did for studio. It was a comprehensive studio at UBC, and the challenge for the comprehensive studio was high density housing. And so one of the challenges in both Vancouver and Toronto is that there is a shortage of housing. So that was a challenge for this project. And so the site was actually in Vancouver. Now, when I was thinking about this project at the time when I was in school, in architecture school, and so again, this was for my master's, I looked at the challenge, I looked at the site, and I'm always looking for ways of getting inspired. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll spend time understanding the site and try to gather inspiration. Is there something unique, or what exactly is the site telling me? And sometimes it actually brings up childhood memories. So for this particular project, this idea of creating high density housing, one thing that brought to my memory was a childhood memory of, as a kid, I always wondered what the neighboring unit looked like. And so one day, our neighbor invited us over. And then to my disappointment, their unit was literally a mirror image of our unit. And so I lost that sense of curiosity and wonder when I started to find out that all the units are basically mirror images. And so for this project, what I wanted to do is actually create efficient, compact density, but also provide unique, customizable units, and each unit would be different. But I wanted to create this customization within a system that could be easily outputted. So I used parametric design. So in this particular project, I actually used Rhino and Grasshopper, came up with a system of points, and all those points represented a unit, and then those points, depending on the proximity from each point, they would produce a cell. And that cell would be representative of that unit. And then what I did is I also took the characteristics of the site, so the wind conditions and the daylight, and that started to generate the form. So now let's take a look here at one of my presentation boards that I put together. So basically, both in Vancouver and Toronto and a lot of major cities, a lot of the housing, the high density housing, are just homogeneous. There's no real individual characteristic. They're not really customizable. They're just copies of each other of a unit, and so that floor is a copy of the other floors, and the units are very much alike. So that was my challenge. So for me, what I was looking at creating is more of an organic form that was unique in itself, but then was very compact and efficient, because it had to be efficient for constructability as well. So I looked at the Verneuil geometry, and so that was kind of the storyline that I started to build, and the concept that really drove a lot of the decisions that I was making for the project. And so each point represented, again, a cell and a unit. And together, those points formulated these cells. And so what I did is I took your typical kind of your boundary and your container, so that would be the floor plate, the maximum floor plate of the tower, and have the structure. You need your cores, elevators, and so on, and then your floor plates. Now the floor plates had to be flat. Okay, technically speaking, they don't have to be flat, but to make life easy for furniture, for regular furniture and so on, they had to be flat. So I used that as my constraints of the site. Then I started to place the points, and these points would represent individual units, but they would also reflect some of the site characteristics of daylight and so on. And so once those points are put, and of course I used Grasshopper and parametrics to do this, the cells were developed, and the proximity of each point would develop that cell, and each cell was unique and organic to itself. Then I start to carve the cells, and that would be in response to the site characteristics, so wind patterns of the site. So how do we increase natural ventilation? So those cells the cells that are being carved out were responding to the site characteristics of wind and daylight to maximize daylight into the units and so on. And so then I intersected that with the form, and then that was how the form was developed, by carving out and subtracting those cells away from the form and those cells were responding to the site characteristics. So these were the algorithms that represented the potential for that variation of each unit. This was what I called my concept board, where I kind of broke down the process of the thinking. So the key thing here is when you are working on a project, you want to illustrate your process. So that's why I started to lay out the process of my thinking and how I started to develop the form and how the form of the building came to be. The top here, I'm talking about the story. What inspired me to this geometry? What inspired me to develop this algorithm? And what initiated the form and the idea of getting to this organic form, and that story coming back to my childhood memories, and then reflecting upon all the buildings that are now up in the air mostly are just copies of each other, and bringing that variation, but doing it in such a way that it's a system that can be customizable. So as part of my second board, I start to illustrate some views of how some of those units would look like, and how that subtraction, where the subtracted cells would represent the daylight that would come into the building, and also the natural ventilation and air. And so because this was a comprehensive studio, we also had to figure out the structure, and we would have to develop the building a little bit further than just concept design from a lot of the studios. So in this case, I started to look at the carved area, that form that's being carved away, look at the panel components and how it can be panelized into a system that could be easily buildable. Well, I say easy, but it would have a system in itself that it would come together into this puzzle. And then I did a surface analysis just to analyze what areas would need more enforcement in terms of structure. And so then there would be this diagrid, and the diagrid would reflect the surface analysis. So where you need more structural support in the red areas, the diagrid would be a lot tighter for additional support. Now remember, at the time I did this, I didn't have much industry experience, and of course we're not structural engineers, so this didn't run through a structural engineer. These were just my rules of thumb that I was using at the time. And so you would get such a form, and this is just a component of the tower. I didn't work everything out. I just kind of isolated this just to show a typical area of how this would come together, and how the facade diagrid and the paneling would work to produce this form. So as part of documenting the site and documenting the building, what I did as well is I wanted to show that variation. So what I did is I did section cuts throughout the building and also in plan to show that variation and how it would develop, starting from the second floor up to the third, fourth, and fifth floor, so you can see here. And then throughout the sections, you would get this variation of forms, and you would see how the form would erode through the building and how it would work. Now, there were some areas that could use a little bit more of an efficiency process, but again, this was just for school. I didn't have to work out everything realistically, but it would need to go through another rigorous hand in just ensuring that everything, all those spaces were usable, because there are some areas that are a little bit not usable in terms of the space, but that's something that would just need to go through another iteration. But for school, for the sake of the concept, this was good enough to showcase. Here I also put a PowerPoint together where I kind of break down. What I also thought of is how this tower would have a system that would react, not only the points within itself in the tower, but they would also react with each other as a system. Now, I don't want to get into the concept too deep, but you can start to see how I kind of break down the concept of how the points work. And then I start to get into how the process of how the building came to be. And so you can start to understand how it's carved away, and then how the plans also work from each other, and so they vary. And then we would get into, so in this case it was around 30 floors, and how the sections would also vary from each other. And so it has this evolution where it kind of erodes through the building. And so here, are some main sections through the building, and here as well. So you would have these areas where it would cut through the building, which brings in daylight and natural ventilation, and it also acts as terraces for outdoor amenity, and then just a ground plan. And then you get here just a podium conceptual perspective of one of the views, and then how the units would work within, and then how the units would work as well. So they're all uniquely shaped. And so here I also talk about and I break down that concept of how the building would camouflage with its surroundings. So we have kind of elevation outline and then the inner geometry, and looking at the city grid. So it's just a simple grid, and then taking the carved geometry, layering it with more information. And this really helps to build that understanding for when you're presenting, just showing how the process of the building came to be really helps your audience to understand what the process was and how the building comes together. So not just documenting the building by showing plans and sections, those are helpful, but you would also have something that talks about the process of how the building came to be. So these type of drawings are really helpful for that, because it really tells the story of how the building came together. And so yeah, this was the screen patterning, and then here we just start to break down some of the shots and so on. So this is basically my project that I did at UBC for high density housing. If you're interested on hearing more of my projects that I did and just walking you through the concept and the process, let me know down in the comments. And of course, this is my design process. Everyone has a different design process, and none is wrong. But the key is to have a storyline, because when you have a storyline, it communicates and connects with people a lot more. And of course, show your process. That's very important as well. You don't just want to document the building, show some renderings, some plans, and some sections. You want to also show how the project came to that form, what was the evolution of it, illustrate that process. It's very important. I hope this was insightful. If it was, make sure to like the video. And of course, if you haven't done so yet, make sure to subscribe. I hope to see you next time. Until then, bye.